colleagues, it's very good to be with you here this morning. One thing I would like to focus on during the next few minutes is to invite you really, firstly to have some short, intense conversations. So there will actually be 3 intervals where I invite you to, in response to a question or two, engage with some other people on your table, because I'd like that to be part of offering you some opportunities to reflect on your own leadership and on things that you might wish to action and take back to your institutions in relation to this topic of engaging stakeholders with courage. So I'll try and unpack that a little bit. I'll try and give you some sort of context and some stimulus, but I'd really like you to think of this in terms of something that you can take away and do differently as a result. And whenever I talk about leadership, I'd really like to emphasise that I'm interpreting that in as broad and inclusive and distributed a sense as possible. The view of the Leadership Foundation is that leadership is, if you like, a quality which is present throughout institutions. It's not denoted specifically only by formal positions of authority, by formal roles. So I'm not just talking about senior managers, I'm not just talking about directors of IT, but literally every professional working in every institution having some kind of leadership role of some sort, whether that's actual or whether it's potential. And that's what I'd like to invite you to think about. I'm minded of something that happens every year in my job role, which is that I've been working for the last 2 or 3 years on our Future Leaders programme. And the Future Leaders programme, there may be some colleagues here who've taken part in it or who've sponsored people to take part in it. Future Leaders programme is a programme that's aimed at people who are typically deputy director level in institutions, and it caters for people in information services, it caters for people in library services, student services and finance. And it's very much around getting people to think about and realise their leadership potential, also to think about how they can work more collaboratively across boundaries within institutions to engage with one another more effectively. And we have a selection process, we have an application process each year, a key part of which is individuals putting forward a proposal for a work-based project that they'd like to spend the year of the programme thinking about and making happen successfully. And I would say one thing that happens every year is that about a third of the applications that we get for these project proposals have an issue, have a problem that they're asked to go back and rework. And it's the issue that the proposal has not taken sufficient account of how the person working the project is going to engage with internal stakeholders in their university. And on reworking it, it's interesting, it's revealing what comes out. People have obviously done a deeper analysis of who they might engage with and thought about some stakeholders that were not otherwise foremost in their mind. And that tends to lead to more effective working across boundaries during the course of the year and so on. It's often the case that there's something missing from their original analysis. And when we actually go through the programme itself, we have sessions that look at stakeholder mapping. And people often have revelatory moments, light bulb moments, where they think, why didn't I think of that particular stakeholder? That is an obvious grouping of people that I need to work with. There's often an underlying theme there about communications and about engagement. And I suspect that there's something also, whether it's conscious or subconscious, about why some stakeholders aren't at the front of people's mind in the first place. And I've become really interested in exploring that over the years, and that's the territory I'd like to sort of take us into now a little bit. So I wonder if I could use this as an opportunity over the next few minutes for you actually to get somebody sitting next to you to be a kind of internal stakeholder to you for the next half hour that you can talk to and that you can engage with, and at the end of the session get a little bit of feedback from, I hope. So I'd like you in a moment just to find one person that you can work with. I'm going to give you 4 minutes at this stage to do this. That'll be 2 minutes one way, 2 minutes another way. If you've got 3 on your table and you want to work as a threesome, that's absolutely fine, but ideally this will work in pairs. So what I'd like to do is actually to get you to think about who are your most demanding internal stakeholders in your universities? Who are the ones that you least enjoy engaging with or even hide away from engaging with? So could you introduce yourselves to your partner here and find out from them who they find the most demanding stakeholder or stakeholders and why? And what I'll do on this, to stop me shouting at you and saying 2 minutes up, change over, what I'll do is, if you see the screen blanking, that will be because the 2 minutes has come to an end, and I'd like you to change partners. So 2 minutes one way, 2 minutes another way, and then when the screen comes back on again, we'll move on. Okay? Who are your most demanding stakeholders? Okay, everybody, thank you very much. Thank you for engaging so heartily in that task. I once made a terrible intercultural blunder and asked a group of people who were about 200 deans from a whole bunch of universities in Thailand to do an exercise like this. And we plunged into 4 minutes of very uncomfortable, complete silence. So I'm glad it's the complete opposite of that here. Thank you for that. If we were 20 in the room, it would be great to get a sample of some of the things that you came up with there. But I eavesdropped a little bit, and I think that I wouldn't mind betting that a good proportion of some of the issues that you were talking about there had at the back of them something to do with a fear factor of some kind. Something probably connected to the behaviours or expected behaviours of other people that you might find demanding to engage with. Something perhaps reflective of the politics and the culture of your university or different parts of the university, different organisations within it, things that create barriers. And many of these interpersonal factors and political factors are obviously those things that stand in the way of collaboration. What I'd like to look at for the next few minutes is what kind of difference can leaders make, and to actually have a look at some core behaviours that I think leaders, when cultivating these, can really help to make a difference and change and face up perhaps with more courage to the idea of engaging stakeholders. So I'd like to start by having a look at this model, which some of you may know, but it's a model which just shows very clearly and starkly those circumstances where leadership differs from management, and the situations where, depending on the vertical column there, how complex a situation is in terms of its ability to be understood, how straightforward or simple it is. And then on the horizontal axis, the sort of styles that are likely to work most effectively in terms of what those in authority or leadership actually do to make change happen. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, there are clearly those situations which are so critical, so urgent, need to be resolved very, very swiftly, and probably can only be resolved by a kind of command and control approach to doing things. And I suspect that those circumstances, whilst they will be familiar to all of us, and they do happen on perhaps a weekly basis, but they're a relatively small proportion of the time and energy that leaders actually find themselves being consumed by. The middle category, I think, is also a category somewhat under threat, because in the increasing complexity of the world that we're all in and the universities that we work in, there are, I guess, rarer situations where things behave in a predictable way, so where problems are relatively tame and where you can use a rational process of a standard toolkit, if you like, standard management approaches to being able to resolve those problems. I suspect that in reality most of us are spending much more of our time towards the top right part, which is the area of leadership, where the problem is not only complex, but sometimes that when you think you've resolved one part of it, something else crops up. It becomes what you might call even a wicked problem. And where really the only solution is by people collaborating with one another. There isn't anybody who can literally take charge and resolve that situation. It's really only a collective effort of trying to reach understanding, trying to investigate a problem, and trying to think of different ways of dealing with it, that can effectively happen. And in this model, Keith Grint suggests that the role of the leader in that situation is not to provide an answer, but in fact to be particularly skilled at putting questions which enable others to perhaps find answers, but others to develop insight and work out what their own contribution might be to developing a solution of some kind. And I think that now we're finding organisations becoming more and more permeable We actually have a feeder programme for the Future Leaders programme now, which is called Leading Across Professional Boundaries. And that whole notion of people becoming skilled at working across or within the convergence that I think exists increasingly in universities, skills to make that happen are becoming increasingly important. The Leadership Foundation for the last 2 years has worked on a really fascinating multi-agency project called Changing the Learning Landscape, which is about making step change happen in learning and teaching strategy through the role that learning technologies can play. That's been really fascinating, both in terms of how we've made that work as a partnership. We're working with JISC, we're working with ALT, the Higher Education Academy, and the National Union of Students, organisations that had never worked together before. And we put together quite a complex partnership, which I think has delivered results for the sector. And interestingly, what's happening within institutions is that this year we set up something called strategic conversations in institutions, where we invited senior managers to come together with student leaders and those responsible for implementation solutions around learning technology, and have really quite complex multi-stakeholder internal conversations, often bringing 20 or 30 different people together around a table that don't normally meet. The report was often that the committee structure doesn't allow people to meet in the same way that they did when they had their strategic conversation. It's a great example of sort of working that permeability across institutions, working in practice. So I guess an initial question here is, where do you focus a lot of your energy when engaging with stakeholders? But I think I'd also like in a moment to add a few things, because I think that increasing complexity and permeability of institutions is meaning that there are a bunch of other behaviours that leaders can do and make work effectively, apart from asking questions. So I'd like to expand on that in a moment. I'd like to just begin with a quick confessional, because in the sort of analysis, whenever you're analysing stakeholders and deciding who has high power in relation to the project I'm working on, who has high interest in this project, and you use that as a way of prioritising who are your key players and who to engage with. When I was a head of department in a university for many years, I made a mistaken assumption. I failed to do this analysis properly, didn't engage the key players because I didn't really understand who they were. I was a very enthusiastic communicator, and I thought that simply by communicating in a scattergun way to everybody in the whole institution, by producing wonderful newsletters and websites, would be a great way to engage with stakeholders. Of course, it didn't actually make any change happen at all. I failed to be discerning enough, and I failed to really firstly identify the key players, but actually secondly to have the courage to engage with those that I knew I had to engage with, but somehow didn't dare, if you like, with those with whom I feared to tread. And I suspect that that might be behind some of the conversations you've had. Just like to put to you the notion that universities, perhaps more than many other organisations in British society, are often characterised by the extent to which deference exists within the universities, and sometimes holds them back, sometimes constrains how people can act together. So, just to take that further, if a university was characterised by high levels of deference, these are some of the sorts of things that you might see happen when people meet. Or these are the sorts of things that people might say in response to a question, what's it like to work here? What actually is the culture in this institution? And I guess that you'll recognise parts of these, and you might not recognise it in a whole institution, you might recognise it in parts of the organisation that you work in. I'd like us to focus not so much on that negative picture, but just another quick conversation, 2 minutes each way, with just thinking about you and your leadership. If you turned all of those points around on their head to think of what's the opposite of all of those, and what actually characterises an institution with low levels of deference, and actually, by definition, probably high levels of engagement and collaboration. What do you do that actually helps to contribute modelling the opposite of those characteristics? What do you do in your leadership that helps to break down some of those things and do the opposite? Again, 2 minutes each way, and I'll put the blank screen on when we're halfway through. Thanks. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So I gather that in the lightning strike part of the session there may be an opportunity to return a bit more to thinking about some of these things. My final slice, really, of what I'd like to share with you is to have a look at a range of core leadership behaviours which have been identified through some really interesting research done at the University of Birmingham, actually around working with stakeholders. This is about working with stakeholders beyond institutions, but I would argue that this applies entirely working within institutions as well. And where that says leaders of place, I'd just like to invite you to read that as leaders of partnership within organisations, because I think that these behaviours that I'll talk you through in a moment apply very, very strongly in that situation. And you'll see that the questioner role, going back to the earlier slide, is in there and plays a very powerful part. Before we actually explore what these are positively and constructively, I'd just like to take you into a slightly different scenario and just get you to think about or paint a picture of a situation where actually these behaviours are not particularly visible at all. And I suspect this may happen more often than not. I'd like you to picture a meeting in a university. And this is a particular meeting where leadership is not particularly in evidence. This, of course, wouldn't be a meeting that you had chaired, but it might be one that you were sitting in, that someone else was perhaps ostensibly chairing, but as I say, leadership not necessarily in evidence. So a meeting like that, with the complete absence of those kind of behaviours, might well involve, you might see people being quite reticent about talking about what they've done, about sharing experience. You might see conflict, you might feel it hanging in the air, but not actually being dealt with. You might see people slipping into a kind of default mode about, well, we're behaving like this because this is how we always do meetings around here. And you might see individuals and the contribution that they can make not being particularly valued or recognised. You may also see people who are attributed by the rest of the people in that meeting to have a certain amount of expertise, and they are kind of deferred to and very often end up imposing a solution which everybody else goes along with. Is that kind of you on a bad day sometimes? I know, it's easy to be complicit in processes like that, and I guess it's easy to say, well, that was their meeting, they were chairing it, so of course it was like that. But in a sense, we've all got that leadership responsibility. If no one else appears to be leading the meeting, then that leader could be each one of us as an individual. We can all influence how things happen, and if we don't influence how they happen, we're complicit in getting, I guess, what we deserve. So I'd like to focus now on some of the behaviours that I think leaders can focus on developing. And I'm not suggesting, I guess that all of us will have a kind of repertoire which involves a blend of some of these sort of behaviours, but you'll probably be able to think of people on your own teams or people that you engage with as other stakeholders in other teams that have these particular characteristics in various different strengths. And actually getting them to work together collaboratively in partnership could be really effective and well worth trying. So just to quickly walk through those, the challenger role, the challenger set of behaviours. This is not the person who always is contrary and always questions what everybody else says. This is actually something a bit is more constructive than that. It's someone who's prepared to take on challenging the prevailing culture, challenging how we always do things around here, but with a very clear kind of vision in their mind about what a constructive alternative to that culture might be like, and actually helps to contribute to developing a new culture in some way, focusing on different behaviours, focusing on outcomes and so on. So really clear sense of what different might be like. People who are influencers are really good at understanding the relational aspects of what happens when people work together in partnerships or in meetings. So they know how to bring in individuals with particular strengths. They know how to understand what drives individuals and what those people can contribute to the sense of the wider partnership. They're really good people, but they can put that to good application. Balancers are often those people who recognise that conflict can sometimes be a very positive source of energy, and that they can somehow not only deal with it, but they can bring constructive resolution as a result of it, and as a result get people to work on collaborating to find something new and something different. And those kind of people who can act in that mediating role can clearly play an extremely valuable role with those leadership behaviours. The questioners, well, we've had a little bit of a look at those already. I think that they're the people who always think about operating beyond the tried and tested. They're the ones who'll say, we can't manage this solution, we can only explore it, we can use questions to try and get different insights into understanding the complexity behind something. And we know that the uncertainty that exists here can actually be positive. It can create an energy that leads to conversations that work and lead to innovative solutions. So the questioner's a very powerful role that they can play. And then finally, and certainly not least, the learners who have a state of mind of using everything as a learning opportunity. These are the kind of people who can help an organisation become genuinely a learning organisation. They're the kind of people who know how to surface issues of failure, for example, and know how to lead a conversation which is, what do we learn from this failure? How can we make sure that people sharing practice rather than hiding from it becomes something that we can harness and becomes effective? So that quick walkthrough of those roles leads me really to my very final task for you, which is just to get you to think about any reflections on how you use those roles in your leadership and what you might do differently. What else could you do as a leader? And can I just ask you, when you have your 2 minutes each way this time, spend the first minute of the 2 minutes just saying something to the other person, and then could you ask the other person to give you a bit of feedback on the conversations that you've had with them during the course of the last half hour? How did you come across? What impressed you most about the person that you were talking with? And is there anything you might identify for them to work on? You've only got a minute to do this, but let's see how that goes. So 2 minutes, which is divided into 1 minute speaking, 1 bit of feedback. Thank you. Well, colleagues, thank you. Just wanted to finally say that if you do a Google search for Birmingham's Leadership of Place, you'll find a document PDF which actually gives you more detail on those core behaviours and what they might mean if you wanted to explore that further. But can I just finally say thank you very much for your energy and engagement this morning. It's very impressive for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, and great to meet you. I'll be around during the course of the morning, so look forward to perhaps some informal conversations. But thank you very much.